Sedimentary and igneous rock. Box 1. So for you to remember that rocks can form in different ways. This causes them to be different types. When sediment is compacted and cemented together, it forms sedimentary rock. So that's how sedimentary rocks are made. Igneous rocks are made when magma cools, it hardens to form igneous rocks. So go back to number 1. So we know that rocks can form in different ways. This causes them to be different types. So if we have sediment, it gets compacted and cemented together to become sedimentary rock. When we start with magma, it cools and it becomes igneous rock. So this is an overall on the back of those notes where magma cools at the surface and becomes igneous rock. We find that when wind and water weather rock on Earth's surface, sorry about that, breaking them into sediments. Let me read that again. So wind and water weather rock on Earth's surface, breaking them into sediments. So then the sediments settle together and get cemented to become sedimentary rock. So let's talk about weathering and erosion.
Could I do that prompt once again? Or you take this one?
So, weathering. The surface of Earth is constantly being transformed by a process called weathering. Remember, weathering is breaking apart rocks into smaller and smaller pieces. So how does the sun's energy form rocks? Okay, we're talking about the sun's energy. Well, weathering is when the energy from the sun causes rock to break down into smaller and smaller pieces, but the sun does not melt or break the rock directly. Well, how are clouds created? Well, the sun's energy warms the ocean and liquid water evaporates into water vapor into the air. Water vapor rises into the air. And so I want you to think about it as steam. So then the water vapor condenses into clouds and falls as snow, rain or snow. So remember, in the atmosphere, it's a little bit cooler. As you go up, it's cooler. And so those water vapors that were once warm now they get brought together, right? They get closer together. And with that forms clouds. And as the water molecules get closer together to form water droplets. That's when it's really, really cold. So how is wind created? Energy from the sun warms the atmosphere, making air move around as wind. So again, the sun is heating up the land, and then hot air is rising. And then as the air cools off, it starts sinking, and that motion creates the wind. So what are some examples of weathering? Well, moving water and air interact with Earth's surface, causing weathering. Remember, weathering is breaking down of rock into smaller and smaller pieces. So the wind, it blows small rock particles over land. And this glacier right here, the glacier grinds against mountains, slowly carving valleys. So water from rain and melting snow forms fast-moving waters. River water bounces rocks around, causing them to bump into each other and break into smaller and smaller pieces. Through this process, giant boulders can break down into tiny pieces of sand. Now for erosion, sediment is moved around by the same wind and water that created it. This process of moving sediment is called erosion. So erosion has to do with movement. Rivers can move sediments downstream, wind can blow sediment to a new location, and rain can cause landslides that make sediment move downhill. All right, the rock cycle. Really pay attention to this one. Here's a video just so we'll go over it. Actually, we'll just go over it. All right, so energy from the sun. Remember that we have two energy sources, and the first one is energy from the sun. Well, the sun creates clouds and wind. So the sun's energy warms the ocean, which creates clouds that produce rain and snow. Remember, that has to do with the weathering. Then the sun's energy warms the atmosphere, making air move around as wind. That too has to do with weathering. So now the rain and snow and the wind causes rocks to break down, and that's the definition of weathering, from rock into sediment. So weathering from wind or rain causes rock to break down into smaller and smaller pieces. That is a definition of weathering. This happens on Earth, on the Earth's surface above the ground. So sedimentary rock is made above the ground. So once the sediment is made, it gets compacted, meaning pressed together, and cemented, means glued. It turns sediment into sedimentary rock. So as you can see, kind of the gravel, when you press it together, then you got the sedimentary rock on the right-hand side, which is conglomerate rock. All right, so how can any rock that you have, how can it become a sedimentary rock? Well, just a reminder, energy from different sources leads to different types of rocks. Let me read that again. Energy from different sources, and those sources are the sun and Earth's interior. Well, guess what? Energy from the sun and the Earth's interior, they create different types of rocks. So when a rock is on Earth's surface, energy from the sun causes rock to weather, remember, breaking it apart, into smaller pieces of rock called sediment. It is then compacted, or pressed, and cemented together, glued, to become sedimentary rock. So let me repeat it again. Energy from different sources, and we have two sources, leads to different types of rock. When a rock is on Earth's surface, energy from the sun causes the rock to weather into smaller pieces of rock called sediment. It is then compacted and cemented together to become sedimentary rock. All right, so now here's the other energy source, energy from Earth's interior. Well, energy from the Earth's interior is extremely hot. There's extreme heat there. Energy from Earth's interior causes rocks to melt. Earth's interior is below the surface. Below, you have to dig very, very, very deep. Miles upon miles upon miles in order to reach the Earth's interior. So energy from the Earth's interior causes melting of rock because it's just so hot. So melted rock becomes magma or liquid rock. That's another name for magma. Melted rock becomes magma, or melted rock becomes liquid rock, just like the picture shows. So when that liquid rock or magma cools and solidifies, means it becomes a solid, it becomes igneous rock. So when the magma or liquid rock cools, it solidifies and becomes igneous rock. So let me go over her again. This is the second energy source. So energy from Earth's interior causes rocks to melt. And remember, this is below the surface. So when the rocks melt, it becomes liquid rock or magma. And when it cools, it solidifies, becomes a solid to become igneous rock. All right, but guess what? Any rock can become igneous rock. Let me repeat. Any type of rock, any rock that you go and pick up from off the ground, it can become an igneous rock. So how can it do that? Well, once again, remember, energy from different sources leads to different types of rocks. Energy from different sources, remember those different sources are the sun and Earth's interior. So that's where we get our energy from. Energy from the sun and Earth's interior, those are two different things. They lead to two different types of rocks. When a rock is below the surface, it has to, so if any rock goes way below the surface, then energy from the Earth's interior will cause that rock to melt. Now, this is not just about digging a hole and then putting a rock in the ground and saying, like, okay, it's going to melt. No, it has to go miles upon miles, deep, deep, deep into Earth. So, energy from the Earth's interior causes rocks to melt. The melted rock turns into liquid rock called magma. When the magma cools, it becomes igneous rock. Now, let me repeat that again. So how can any rock become igneous rock? Well, energy from different sources leads to different types of rock. When a rock is below the surface, energy from Earth's interior causes rock to melt. The melted rock turns into liquid rock called magma. When magma cools, it becomes igneous rock. And let me just go over this really quick. So in this particular example right here, or actually the page, it asks basically, what would happen if the rock sample pictured was first exposed to energy from the sun, then a million years later exposed to energy from Earth's interior? So this is an igneous rock, but it pretty much applies to any rock. So energy from the sun would cause weathering to make sediment. Compaction and cementation would turn the sediment into sedimentary rock. And then energy from Earth's interior would cause melting, and the rock would turn into magma. Let's do this one. So what would happen to this sedimentary rock if it was first exposed to the energy from the sun, and then a million years later was exposed to the energy from Earth's interior? So let's start again. Energy from the sun would cause weathering to make sediment. Compaction and cementation would turn the sediment into sedimentary rock. And then energy from Earth's interior would cause melting. And then the rock would turn into magma. All right, so now let's take this sedimentary rock and then expose it to the energy of Earth's interior. Do that first. And then expose it a million years later, expose it to the energy from the sun. So let's do this. Energy from Earth's interior would cause melting of the rock and turn it into magma. The magma would cool and turn into igneous rock. Then energy from the sun would cause weathering to turn the rock into sediment. And last, let's take this igneous rock and first expose it to the energy from Earth's interior, and then a million years later, expose it to the energy from the sun. How could this happen? Well, we have energy from Earth's interior would cause melting, and then the rock would turn into magma. The magma would cool and turn it into igneous rock. Then energy from the sun would cause weathering to turn it into sediment.